In the stillness of a quiet neighborhood where life moved at the slow, predictable pace of routine, there lived a cat unlike any other. Her name was Luna, a name whispered with warmth and familiarity by every child who passed the Wilson families. White picket fence, with fur like molten gold kissed by the sun and eyes the color of deep summer grass, Luna seemed touched by something almost celestial. Yet her beauty was only the outer shell of a heart that pulsed with something greater, a compassion that seemed to spill beyond her small feline body, reaching out to every fragile life that crossed her path. The Wilsons, Emma, David, and their 8-year-old daughter Sophie had found her on a cold winter morning, shivering in a damp cardboard box outside a grocery store. Sophie, with eyes wide and pleading, had begged her parents to let her take the trembling kitten home. And so, from that moment, Luna's story had been woven into theirs. Those first weeks were filled with patience and whispered lullabies from a little girl lying flat on her belly, speaking in soft tones to the creature hiding beneath her bed. Trust was not given easily, but it bloomed slowly, like the first wildflowers after snowmelt. Soon, Luna's intelligence began to surprise them. Doors that somehow opened themselves, lights that flicked on under her paw, the way she carried Sophie's school bag to the door every morning like a loyal guardian. She became the quiet heartbeat of the house, always there, always watching. When Sophie once brought home an injured bird, it was Luna who sat sentinel by its box, keeping vigil until its wings carried it back to the sky. When a thunderstorm shook the world and baby squirrels tumbled into their backyard, it was Luna who braved the rain, carrying each trembling body to safety on the porch, curling around them until morning came. She wasn't just a cat. She was proof that love can cross species and speak a universal language. The righteous care for the needs of their animals. And in Luna's small frame lived a righteousness that words could barely contain. The first sign that something was wrong came like a shadow over a sunny afternoon. Luna began to change. She sat for hours at the window, staring into the distance, with an expression that made Emma's chest tighten. She no longer bounded into the kitchen at mealtimes or curled in Sophie's lap during story hour. Restlessness claimed her nights. The once quiet house was filled with the sound of her pacing, her soft meows low and mournful, as if calling to someone unseen. The Wilsons watched, helpless, as her spirit seemed to drift away. David wondered if she was sick. Sophie feared she had done something wrong. Emma just knew, deep down, that Luna's heart was heavy with something unspoken. Then, one evening, the mystery deepened. Luna scratched at the closet door, eyes wide and anxious, before vanishing for hours, only to return exhausted, her fur ruffled and paws dirty. Days passed, each one adding to the family's growing fear. Finally, they rushed her to the vet, bracing for the kind of news that turns the world cold. The examination felt endless. Then the vet's lips curved into a smile, and with a voice full of gentle wonder, he said, "Luna is going to have kittens." Relief crashed over them, tangled with excitement and worry. Sophie clapped her hands, already imagining tiny paws and high-pitched mews. Emma fretted over Luna's health. David began planning for new blankets, safe corners, and warm lamps. The days leading up to the birth were full of preparation. Sophie made a nest of soft old blankets. David brought home food rich in nutrients, and Emma never let Luna out of her sight. But when the day came, nature did not follow the script they had written in their hearts. Luna slipped away to the quiet of the shed, curling into the bed she had chosen. Hours dragged by like heavy chains, the air tense with anticipation. Then, the purring stopped. The silence that followed was thick, unnatural. When Luna emerged, her movements were slow, her head bowed. David went to check the nest, and his face drained of color. 3 tiny bodies lay still and cold, stillborn, the weight of that moment pressed down on them all. Sophie cried into Emma's arms. David turned away, swallowing hard. Luna, however, did not understand death the way humans do. She stayed by her kittens, licking them, trying to warm them back to life. Her cries, low, aching, raw, pierced the Wilsons to their core. That night they sat with her, powerless against the finality of what had happened. The Lord is close to the broken-hearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. And in that dim shed, under the quiet watch of the moon, it seemed, the Lord himself must have been sitting with a grieving cat. In the days that followed, Luna's spirit dimmed. She no longer explored the house or greeted the neighbors' children. She would perch by the window, staring not at the birds or leaves, but at nothing at all, as if her gaze was turned inward, fixed on something she could not let go. Sophie tried everything, dangling strings, chasing games, even reading her bedtime stories again. Luna watched politely but without interest. Emma called the vet for advice. David suggested they give her time, but the house felt emptier, even with all of them in it. One sweltering summer afternoon, as cicadas hummed in the trees and heat shimmered off the pavement, Sophie was playing in the yard when she heard it, a faint, muffled sound from beyond the fence. She froze, head tilted, listening. There it was again, a high-pitched whimper, desperate and small. Heart-pounding, Sophie pushed aside the tall grass at the fence line and peered through a gap in the boards. Her breath caught. On the other side, emerging from the shadowed space between the fence and the neighbor's shed, was Luna, but she was not alone. Clamped gently in her mouth was a tiny, squirming puppy. Sophie's eyes widened. The neighbor's dog was known for being mean, territorial, and unkind to anything smaller than itself. What was Luna doing? Sophie dropped to her knees just in time for Luna to push through a loose slat in the fence, padding carefully into their yard with her precious cargo. Sophie's voice trembled as she called for her parents. Emma and David came running, stopping short when they saw what Luna had done. The puppy's fur was matted, its body trembling, its eyes barely open. And Luna, their grieving, silent Luna, was purring for the first time in weeks, curling herself protectively around the fragile creature. They didn't know yet how many trips she had made or what danger she had faced, but in that moment, one truth was clear. Luna had chosen to love again. She had gone into the territory of a dangerous dog, risking herself, because somewhere deep inside she had heard a cry and answered it. Whoever rescues a life saves the whole world. And in the quiet backyard of the Wilson home, the world felt a little more whole again. The scream that tore from Sophie's throat that afternoon was not born of fear, but of shock so pure it felt like lightning in the summer air. "Mom! Dad, come quick!" Her voice cracked under the weight of disbelief, the urgency in it pulling Emma and David from their chairs before their minds could even form a question. They burst into the yard, feet pounding the grass, and then froze as if time itself had taken a breath. There, in the patch of sunlight between the lilac bush and the old oak, sat Luna, their grieving, hollow-eyed cat who had been wrapped in sorrow since the loss of her kittens. But now she was crouched low, her tail curled protectively, gently lowering a tiny, crying black Labrador puppy onto the warm grass. The small creature wobbled, blind eyes shut, and let out a sound so fragile it felt like a plea for life itself. Luna, with movements delicate as silk unraveling, nuzzled the puppy's head as though it were her own flesh and blood. David blinked hard, his voice trembling between awe and confusion. That's a dog," he stammered, rubbing at his eyes like he couldn't trust them. "Luna is caring for a Labrador puppy," Emma whispered, her words heavy with amazement and an unspoken question. Where had it come from? How had she found it? The air between them was thick with both wonder and worry. David's voice broke the spell. "We should probably take it inside, call animal control, or bring it to a shelter." But Emma's eyes lingered on Luna, watching the way her paws curled around the puppy, the way her purr rose and fell like a lullaby. Something inside her rebelled against the thought of separation. While her parents debated, Sophie vanished into the house, reappearing moments later with an old wicker basket and a blanket worn soft with years of family use. She placed the basket beside Luna and with careful hands lifted the puppy in. Without hesitation, Luna leapt in after it, curling around the small body with a sigh that sounded almost like relief. And in that moment, Emma and David exchanged a glance, not of agreement, but of surrender. For now, the puppy would stay. Defend the weak and the fatherless. uphold the cause of the poor and the oppressed. Perhaps, they thought, Luna was doing exactly that. In her own way, the days that followed were a strange and beautiful kind of wonder. The Wilsons printed and posted signs on telephone poles, hoping someone would come forward to claim the puppy, but the phone stayed silent. In the meantime, Luna's devotion grew more astonishing by the hour. She licked the puppy clean after every feeding, curling her body around him at night so he slept in a warm cocoon of fur and heartbeat. Sophie watched, wide-eyed, as Luna began to nurse him, something the vet later confirmed was rare but possible. Her milk unexpectedly nourishing the little one despite the difference in species. Luna awoke every 2 hours to feed him, never once seeming tired, as though her own grief had been exchanged for a mission. On the third morning after the puppy's arrival, Luna disappeared again. The Wilsons barely noticed at first, assuming she was on one of her usual patrols. But when she returned, jaws clenched around yet another tiny black-furred puppy, their world tilted further into mystery. She padded straight to the basket and laid the newcomer beside the first, curling her tail around both like a mother counting her children. The Wilsons were speechless. David's brow furrowed. "Where is she finding these puppies?" he muttered. Emma, torn between awe and unease, could only shake her head. Over the next several days the pattern continued. Luna would vanish, only to reappear carrying yet another dark-furred infant in her mouth, a third, then a fourth, then impossibly a fifth. By week's end the basket overflowed with squirming Badas, each watched over by a golden-furred cat whose eyes now gleamed with a fierce, protective light. It was a sight both miraculous and bewildering. Luna's body, however, could only produce so much milk. Recognizing the strain, Sophie stepped into the role of caretaker without hesitation. She fed the puppies from bottles of warm formula, Luna watching intently with an expression that felt almost like gratitude. After every feeding, Luna would groom each pup's face as though sealing the nourishment in with her love. Word of the strange family spread through the neighborhood like fire on dry grass. Some came with smiles, calling Luna a hero. Others came with narrowed eyes, their whispers tinged with suspicion. Mrs. Johnson, the elderly woman across the street, was the loudest voice of doubt. "That cat is stealing puppies," she told anyone who'd listen, her voice sharp with certainty. "Mark my words, she's taking them from other dogs." But for every voice like hers, there was another like Mr. Thompson's, the baker, down the road, who brought fresh bread to the Wilsons every morning, insisting that any home with such love in it deserved to be blessed. Children begged to visit, crowding around Sophie as she proudly introduced Luna's babies, like siblings in a family portrait. "Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy." And in the Wilsons' living room, mercy had taken the form of a cat and 5 orphaned pups, but miracles often arrive with burdens. The Wilson household, once neat and predictable, now pulsed with the chaos of new life. Feeding schedules, cleaning up messes, vet appointments. The bills grew heavier with each passing week, stacking on the kitchen counter like silent accusations. Tempers began to fray. One evening, after scraping yet another muddy paw print from the carpet, David sighed heavily. "We can't keep doing this," he said, his voice low, but edged with exhaustion. Emma, sitting on the floor beside Luna and the puppies, looked up. "I know," she murmured, "but look at her, David. Look how happy she is." And it was true. Luna's eyes no longer held the dull glaze of loss. She moved with purpose, her tail high, her body language saying what her voice could not. "These are mine. I will protect them." Yet outside their home, the tide was turning. Whispers became pointed stares. A man in a dark sedan parked at the curb one afternoon, camera lens glinting in the sunlight as it aimed at their backyard. David spotted neighbors huddled together, speaking in low tones that stopped when he passed. Mrs. Johnson began talking about calling animal control, her claims growing louder and more elaborate. Emma started hesitating before stepping onto the porch, feeling the burn of unseen eyes on her back. She had always believed kindness was contagious, but now she feared It might also make you a target. And through it all, Luna carried on as though nothing in the world existed beyond the warm bodies pressed against her fur. She was untouched by the gossip, immune to the politics of human fear. In her world, there were only 5 lives worth guarding, and the instinct to protect them was as old as creation itself. The Good Shepherd lays down his life for the sheep, and in their modest home, the Wilsons were watching a Good Shepherd take the form of a golden-furred cat, who would not surrender what her heart had claimed. The rain-soaked streets of the little town lay under a heavy blanket of gray that evening, but inside the Wilson household, an even heavier cloud hung over the family. Sophie sat at the window, her chin resting on her knees, staring out into the fading light. Her parents' whispered conversations over the last few days had been tense and filled with worry, the neighbors' complaints, the strange glances at Luna, and the whispered words stealing were tearing at her heart. She could see the strain on her parents' faces, see how the joy in their home had dimmed. She decided then and there she couldn't just sit by, she would find the truth. So she began her own investigation, watching for hours through the glass, her eyes tracking Luna's every move, her breath hitching every time the cat's tail disappeared into the dusk. Meanwhile, Luna seemed blissfully unaware of the growing storm around her. She carried herself with the calm grace of a guardian, curling around the tiny puppies as if they were her own kittens, grooming their heads with deliberate tenderness, playing with them, teaching them the rituals of her world. Sophie had never seen anything more extraordinary. Tiny paws, copying the swipe of Luna's tongue as they learned to clean themselves. It was as if some invisible thread bound them together, and in Sophie's heart an unshakable conviction began to grow. This wasn't theft, it was salvation. The righteous care for the needs of their animals, but the kindest acts of the wicked are cruel. The tension broke with a knock that rattled the Wilsons' doorframe one evening, just when everyone in the house was stretched to their breaking point. Sophie's mother froze mid-step, her father exchanged a grim glance with her, and Sophie's own pulse thudded in her ears. When the door swung open, there stood a uniformed police officer flanked by several uneasy neighbors. "We need to talk about your cat and these puppies," the officer said, his voice measured but firm. The Wilsons stepped aside, inviting him in with hesitant politeness, though every heartbeat screamed of fear. In the living room, the sight that greeted the officer was nothing short of breathtaking. Luna, sprawled like a queen in her basket, 5 tiny puppies nestled against her, their small chests rising and falling in the rhythm of innocent dreams. Even the officer's stoic face softened, his brow lifting in surprise. He listened quietly as the Wilsons explained what little they knew. Luna, disappearing for hours and returning with a single puppy each time. The officer's questions were deliberate, but before long, a small voice broke the silence. "Officer, I've been watching Luna," Sophie said, summoning a courage she didn't know she had. "She always goes toward that old abandoned house at the edge of town." The room seemed to grow stiller with those words. The officer leaned forward, his eyes narrowing with interest. Moments later, he and David, Sophie's father, were on their way, leaving Sophie and her mother behind to guard the little ones and their feline protector. "Speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, for the rights of all who are destitute." The abandoned house stood like a scar against the dying sky, its shattered windows staring out like hollow, mournful eyes. The front door dangled on its rusted hinges, swaying slightly in the evening wind. "Stay close," the officer murmured, one hand brushing the handle of his flashlight. Each step onto the porch groaned beneath David's weight, sending shivers of unease through him. "Should we call for backup?" he asked, his voice cracking just enough to betray his fear. "Not yet," came the low reply. Inside, the air was a stagnant mix of dust and something far more sinister, the sour, metallic tang of decay. Every footstep sent echoes bouncing into the shadows. Then faint and trembling came a sound, a whimper, so soft it could have been mistaken for the wind. "Did you hear that?" David whispered. The officer swung his flashlight toward the far end of the room, cutting through the dark until the beam found a shape in the corner. What they saw made them both stop cold. A skeletal black labor lay sprawled on a mound of stained newspapers, her ribs jutting against the thin skin, fur matted with dirt and neglect. Her eyes, fever-bright yet half-closed, barely flickered toward them. Around her were the raw signs of recent birth, soiled rags, a faint but unmistakable smell. She had fought to live here, alone, without help, without hope. She's been here for days. Maybe weeks, the officer murmured, crouching down. David's throat tightened. How is she still alive? He whispered, but the question had no answer. In that dim, broken place, the enormity of what Luna had been doing settled heavily over them. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. When they returned to the Wilson home an hour later, their faces told the story before. Their words could. Emma, standing in the hallway, saw the ashen look in her husband's eyes and knew they had stumbled upon something both tragic and profound. What did you find? She asked softly. David's voice trembled. A mother dog. She's been starving in that house, too weak to care for her babies. The officer added, We called animal rescue. They're on their way. Silence followed, heavy and full of realization. Sophie's eyes grew wide and she covered her mouth as the pieces fell into place. Luna hadn't been stealing. She had been saving one tiny life at a time, carrying them to safety in the only way she could. Word of her acts spread quickly. The town that had once looked at the Wilsons with suspicion now looked at them, and at Luna, with awe. The local vet offered to treat the Labrador mother free of charge. The Wilsons watched as Luna continued to curl protectively around the puppies, her purr rumbling like a steady heartbeat. And when the day came for the mother dog, now strong and healthy, to be reunited with her pups, Luna stepped back with quiet dignity, staying close as if to give her blessing. In that moment, everyone watching felt something shift, a reminder that compassion doesn't recognize the boundaries of species, that love is a language all living beings understand. Two are better than one because they have a good return for their labor. If either falls, one can help the other up. And so, in a small town where suspicion once cast long shadows, a humble cat named Luna became a beacon of light. She hadn't waited for someone else to act. She hadn't questioned whether the lives she saved were hers to protect. She simply followed the quiet voice inside that said, "Help." In her soft paws and steadfast heart, she carried a lesson. The world often forgets that courage is not always loud, and love is not always bound by blood. We live in a world where headlines often tell us about what's wrong, but Luna's story reminds us that there's a far greater force than fear, the instinct to care. Even when no one is watching, whoever saves one life saves the world entire. So let Luna's journey be more than just a touching animal story or a viral headline. Let it be a call to action, to open our doors, to guard the vulnerable, and to live with the kind of love that doesn't keep score. Because sometimes the most powerful rescues don't happen in grand arenas or with roaring applause. They happen quietly in living rooms, in forgotten houses, in the unlikeliest places, when an ordinary soul decides to do something extraordinary. And if a little cat can change the destiny of a family, a neighborhood, and countless hearts around the world, imagine what you can do.